Hi everyone, welcome back to True Crime Echoes. Today we're diving into one of the most infamous legends ever whispered in the dark, the story of Bloody Mary. You've probably heard the game, maybe even played it standing in front of a mirror, chanting her name, waiting for a ghost to appear. But behind that legend lies the very real story of Mary Tudor, a queen whose life was filled with betrayal, heartbreak, false pregnancies, and a desperate struggle for power. This isn't just a ghost story. It's a tale of a woman who was both a ruler and a prisoner of her own fate. So settle in, because the truth behind Bloody Mary is darker, more human, and far more tragic than the myth. Chapter 1. The Urban Legend of Bloody Mary. When I was a kid, there was always that one game people dared each other to play at sleepovers. You know the one I mean, the lights go off, a single candle burns, and someone whispers, "Let's do Bloody Mary." Even just saying those words out loud could make your stomach twist with both excitement and fear. It wasn't just a game, it felt like testing fate. The ritual was simple, but it carried a weight of mystery. You'd stand in front of a mirror, usually in the bathroom, the kind of place where the silence seemed heavier at night. The rules varied depending on who told the story. Some said you had to call her name 3 times, others swore it had to be 13. And every kid was convinced their version was the real one, so you'd stand there, face dimly lit by the flickering flame, and whisper, "Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary." And then everyone would hold their breath, waiting for something to happen. What was supposed to happen? Well, that depended on the legend you'd heard. Some swore that the ghostly figure of a woman would appear in the mirror, her face pale and streaked with blood. Others said she would scream, curse you, or even reach through the glass to scratch your eyes out. In some versions, she held a lifeless baby in her arms, a haunting image that only added to the dread. The scariest part was how real it felt in that moment. Even if nothing ever appeared, your imagination filled in the blanks. Maybe it was just the candle flickering, or your own reflection warping in the dark glass, but it was enough to convince you that something unnatural was lurking just beyond your sight. This wasn't just some childish prank, it was a tradition passed down through generations, whispered at parties, retold in hushed voices at school, and kept alive because of how deeply it played on universal fears, darkness, death, and the unknown. The question, though, is, who exactly is Bloody Mary? Why is she so angry, so blood-soaked, so tragic? And why do children around the world still whisper her name into mirrors, as if daring her ghost to prove she's real? That's where the story begins, because behind the legend, there's history. And as with most legends, the truth is far more disturbing than the game itself. Chapter 2. Mirrors, Folklore, and Old Superstitions. The thing about the Bloody Mary ritual is that it didn't just come out of nowhere. Mirrors have always carried this strange, almost supernatural weight in human history. For centuries, people have believed that mirrors are more than just polished glass. They're portals, gateways between the living and the spirit world. Think about it. When you stare into a mirror, you're looking at yourself, but not really. It's your reflection, your double. And in so many cultures, the double is tied to something spiritual, even dangerous. Some believed that if a mirror broke, your soul could be fractured. Others covered mirrors in houses where someone had died, afraid the spirit might get trapped inside. So when children dared each other to summon Bloody Mary, they were unknowingly tapping into a tradition that was already centuries old. Back in the 19th century, there was this bizarre folk ritual that young women would play something almost like a cousin to the Bloody Mary game. They'd walk backwards up a staircase, usually in a darkened house, carrying a candle, and they'd glance into a mirror as they passed by. And what they expected to see wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was either the face of the man they were destined to marry or a skull. If you saw a skull, well, it meant you were doomed to die before marriage. Creepy, right? And yet people did it. It makes you realize how much fear and fascination have always been tied to reflections. A simple piece of glass could feel like a doorway to fate itself, love, death, destiny, or something far darker. So by the time Bloody Mary as a game took root, the groundwork was already there. A mirror in a dark room, a flickering candle, a whispered name. All of it was built on the idea that mirrors can reveal what's hidden, whether it's your future or a ghost waiting to be unleashed. And that brings us to the next big question: who exactly is this Mary we're calling out to in the mirror? Because depending on who you ask, she might be a murdered witch, a tragic spirit, or a real queen whose reign was soaked in blood. Chapter 3: Who was Bloody Mary? The funny thing about legends is that they shift depending on who's telling them. Ask 10 different people who Bloody Mary is, and you'll get 10 different answers. Some swear she was a witch named Mary Worth, a woman accused of sorcery and executed by frightened villagers centuries ago. Others believe she was a woman who died tragically in a car crash, her restless spirit trapped between worlds. And then there's the version that ties her to real history, the one that points to Mary I of England, the Queen, whose name would forever be remembered in blood. Let's start with the witch story. Mary Worth was supposedly a woman living in colonial America accused of practicing witchcraft. The details are fuzzy. Some say she kidnapped children, others that she made pacts with the devil. As the story goes, the villagers captured her, executed her, and she swore vengeance with her last breath. The legend says her spirit lingered trapped in mirrors, waiting for someone foolish enough to call her name. But the Mary Worth story feels more like folklore than fact. There's no hard evidence that she ever existed. Still, it's the kind of tale that would thrive around campfires and echo in small towns where superstition carried as much weight as truth. Then there's the car crash version. Some people say Bloody Mary was once an ordinary woman killed in a violent accident. Her face was supposedly mutilated, covered in blood, and that's why she appears so horribly in the mirror. But again, there's no real evidence, just whispers, rumors that grew legs and spread. The most compelling version, though, is tied to Mary Tudor, Mary Tudor of England. She wasn't a myth or a ghost story. She was a real queen, born in 1516, daughter of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. History remembers her as Bloody Mary because of the hundreds of executions that took place under her rule. And this is where the legend takes on a whole new dimension, because suddenly we're not just talking about folklore, we're talking about politics, religion, betrayal, and a woman who is both powerful and feared. So when kids whisper Bloody Mary into a bathroom mirror, they may not realize it, but they're invoking centuries of superstition, tragedy, and one of the most infamous queens in English history. And trust me, Mary's real story is even darker than the legend. Chapter 4: The Making of a Queen. To really understand why Mary the Eye of England became known as Bloody Mary, you have to go back to her childhood. She was born in 1516, the only surviving child of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. At first, she was her father's pride and joy, educated, bright, and trained like a proper royal. But her life took a sharp, painful turn when her father's obsession with having a male heir destroyed the family. Henry VIII was desperate for a son. He wanted someone to secure his dynasty to carry on his name. And when Catherine didn't give him a boy, Henry decided that their marriage was cursed. At least that's the excuse he gave. In truth, he had his eyes on another woman, Anne Boleyn. So he cast Catherine aside, declared Mary illegitimate, and broke the bond between mother and daughter. For Mary, this wasn't just politics. It was deeply personal. She was cut off from her mother, forbidden from even visiting her. Imagine being a teenager and being told that your parents' marriage never counted, that your place in the world had been erased with a single royal decree. That kind of rejection leaves scars. When Henry married Anne Boleyn, the damage to Mary's future was set. Anne gave birth to Elizabeth, who would one day become Elizabeth III. And Henry made sure Elizabeth was placed above Mary in the line of succession. Overnight, Mary went from being a princess to a political pawn. She wasn't just displaced, she was humiliated. It didn't help that Catherine's death years later was shrouded in mystery. Many suspected poison, and Mary never forgave Anne or Henry for what she believed was her mother's murder. Whether or not that was true didn't matter, the anger stayed with her. So, when we think about Mary, it's important to remember that she wasn't born a monster. She was shaped by betrayal, abandonment, and a father who treated her as disposable. That kind of upbringing doesn't just disappear when you put on a crown. It festers. And eventually, when Mary did rise to power, All that bitterness, all that pain, it poured out in the way she ruled. Chapter 5. Mary's Rise to Power. By the time Mary was in her 30s, her chances of ever ruling England seemed almost impossible. Her father, Henry VIII, was gone. Her half-brother Edward VI had become king, and as a Protestant ruler, he had no interest in handing power over to his Catholic sister. He and his advisors worked hard to push Mary out of the line of succession. When Edward died young, the Protestant elite tried one last maneuver to keep Mary from the throne. They placed Lady Jane Grey, just a teenager, in power. It was a political move, meant to block Mary and secure Protestant control. But it didn't last. Mary rallied support, and surprisingly, the people came to her side. She marched into London not as a villain, but as a queen with popular backing. Imagine that moment after years of being cast aside, treated as illegitimate and humiliated. Mary finally held the crown in her hands. At 37 years old, she became the first woman to rule England in her own right. For Mary, this wasn't just about politics, it was about vindication. Everything she had suffered as a child and young woman, all the rejection and pain, suddenly felt like it had meaning. She believed God himself had restored her to the throne. And with that belief came a mission. Mary was determined to undo the religious changes that had torn England apart under her father and brother. She wanted to restore Catholicism to bring the country back under what she saw as the one true faith. But with that mission came pressure to secure the dynasty with an heir. At 37, Mary knew time wasn't on her side, so she turned her focus to marriage, to finding a husband who could give her the son her father had always wanted, the son she believed England still needed. That decision, the one she thought would secure her legacy, would instead lead her into heartbreak, scandal, and the strange chapter of history that made her a legend. Chapter 6. A Marriage and a Phantom Child. When Mary took the throne, one of her first priorities was marriage. She needed to produce an heir, someone who could continue her mission of restoring Catholicism in England. The man chosen for her was Philip II of Spain. On paper, it was the perfect match. He was powerful, Catholic, and politically useful. But in reality, the marriage was cold. Philip wasn't in love with Mary. He was younger, ambitious, and more concerned with expanding his empire than with building a real relationship. For Mary, though, he was everything. She wanted love, companionship, and most of all, a child. She pinned her hopes on him. Just a few months after the wedding, Mary was convinced she was pregnant. She had all the signs. Her stomach began to swell, she stopped menstruating, and she even reported feeling the baby move. For her, this was proof that God was blessing her reign. She believed her suffering was finally going to be redeemed. The court prepared for the birth. Plans were made, midwives assembled, and the country waited for the arrival of a Catholic heir. But as the months went by, no child came. Rumors spread that Mary was faking it, that she was desperate enough to steal another woman's baby and pass it off as her own. Others whispered that God was punishing her, that she wasn't fit to rule. The truth was devastating. Mary wasn't pregnant at all. She had experienced what we now call a false pregnancy, or pseudocyesis, a condition where the mind and body trick themselves into believing a child is on the way. Her belly had grown. Her symptoms were real, but there was no baby. When it finally became clear that there would be no heir, Mary's hope collapsed. Her health suffered, her confidence faltered, and her marriage to Philip grew even colder. He spent more and more time abroad, leaving her isolated. But instead of softening Mary, this heartbreak hardened her. She believed God was testing her, and if she couldn't give England a Catholic child, then she would give England something else, a warning. And that warning came in fire. Chapter 7. The Fires of Faith. After the devastation of her false pregnancy, Mary grew even more determined to prove her worth not just as a queen, but as a servant of God. In her eyes, England's soul was at stake. The years of Protestant reform under her father and brother had to her poisoned the nation. She believed it was her divine duty to burn that poison out, and she meant it literally. In 1555, the Marian persecutions began. Hundreds of Protestants were arrested, tried for heresy, and condemned. Some were famous preachers, others were ordinary men and women, farmers, laborers, even the illiterate who couldn't recite prayers correctly. To Mary, none of that mattered. If they defied the Catholic faith, they defied God, and defiance meant death. The punishment was brutal. They were tied to wooden stakes surrounded by bundles of dry straw and set on fire. The smoke and flames weren't just meant to kill, they were meant to terrify the living into obedience. And Mary believed that if enough people saw the fire, they would turn back to the Catholic Church. But the effect wasn't what she expected. Instead of quelling resistance, the burnings fueled hatred. People began to see her not as a savior of faith, but as a tyrant. Her name became synonymous with cruelty. The very legacy she was trying to build of being God's chosen queen was slipping away, replaced by fear and loathing. And yet Mary didn't stop. She believed each execution was justified, a holy act, even if the rest of the world recoiled. This is where her story begins to fracture, where a woman scarred by betrayal and desperation turned into the figure we remember today as Bloody Mary. Chapter 8. A Second Hope. A Final Decline. Despite the anger of her people and the fires that had already scarred her reign, Mary still clung to hope. She still longed for a child. And in 1557, she once again announced that she was pregnant. At first she was confident. She felt the same symptoms as before, her body swelling, her cycles stopping, her mind convinced that this time it was real. She told her court, she told her husband, and she told herself that God was giving her a second chance. But the truth was crueler. This wasn't a pregnancy. It was the beginning of her body breaking down. What she thought were signs of life were actually signs of sickness. Historians now believe it was ovarian cancer, though, in her time, no one could explain it. Even worse, Philip showed no interest. He had drifted away long before consumed by his own empire and battles. To him, Mary was a political alliance, not a wife. And as she wasted away, she was left with loneliness and a crown that felt heavier than ever. Meanwhile, her half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the very woman Mary had despised, was waiting in the wings. The people, already disillusioned by Mary's burnings and her failed pregnancies, looked to Elizabeth as a brighter hope. In November of 1558, at just 42 years old, Mary died. No heir, no legacy, no redemption. Only the name history gave her Bloody Mary. Her sister Elizabeth would take the throne and go on to rule for decades, remembered as one of England's greatest monarchs. But Mary was remembered as the queen who failed, defined not by her courage or her suffering, but by her burnings, her phantom pregnancies, and the ghost story that carries her name. Chapter 9. The Legend in the Mirror. Mary's story didn't end with her death. In fact, it only transformed. Over the centuries, people stripped away the real woman and turned her into a legend. The name Bloody Mary stopped meaning a queen who struggled with betrayal, false pregnancies, and the weight of faith. It became something else entirely. Children began to whisper it at sleepovers, daring each other to stand in front of a mirror and say her name 3 times. They believed she would appear, her face twisted with blood, sometimes holding a dead child in her arms. Some swore she screamed at them, others claimed she reached out from the glass. Think about that for a moment. A queen who longed desperately for a baby, who was mocked for her phantom pregnancies, became a ghost story about a woman cradling a dead child. The irony is almost unbearable. And so Mary's pain, her inability to be what her people demanded, her failure to create an heir, her desperate attempts to hold power, was twisted into a game, a chant, a childhood dare. It's cruel in a way. The world remembers her not for the impossible pressures she lived under, but for the horror of her choices and the myth she inspired. Maybe that's the real tragedy of Bloody Mary. She was never just a monster in the mirror. She was a woman trapped by history, crushed between duty, faith, and the desperate human need to be loved and remembered. And whether we whisper her name in the dark or read about her reign in the light of day, one thing is certain: Mary Tudor will never be forgotten. And that, my friends, is the true story behind the legend of Bloody Mary. A queen remembered not for her courage or her suffering, but for the blood she spilled and the ghost story she inspired. Whether you see her as a victim of circumstance, a tyrant consumed by faith, or simply a woman crushed by the weight of history, her name has echoed for centuries and will continue to echo every time someone dares to whisper it into a mirror. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to True Crime Echoes for more real crime cases and the legends they leave behind. Until next time, make good choices, stay safe, and maybe think twice before saying her name in the dark.